My 70-year-old hands were still shaking violently when a woman who had absolutely no right to stand in my kitchen slid the heavy stack of legal documents across the worn oak table. With a venomous, triumphant smile dancing on her lips, she looked me dead in the eye and whispered that I had signed everything away, that the corporate transaction was finalized, and this historic family ranch was no longer mine to stand on. Before the weight of her words could even register in my fogged mind, my own son, a boy I had loved, protected, and raised with my own two hands, stepped forward, gripped the brass knob of the front door, and flung it wide open. He pointed his finger out into the pitch black, freezing Texas rain, and told me to leave the property right now, warning me not to make this transition any harder than it already had to be. I walked out into that blinding storm with nothing to my name but an old canvas bag, a sodden jacket, and a lifetime of bitter, broken memories. But what those greedy vultures completely failed to realize was that the very next morning, while they were inside my stolen family home drinking my whiskey and celebrating their easy victory, a massive fleet of 50 black luxury vehicles would silently roll through that front gate. And when one man dressed in a flawless, tailored black suit stepped out of the lead vehicle, my son's jaw would hit the muddy earth, because the forgotten old carpenter they thought they had poisoned, outsmarted, and discarded had just unleashed a multi-million-dollar legal trap designed to completely strip them of their freedom and reclaim every single inch of the land beneath their feet. To truly understand how a son could drive his own father out into a storm, you have to understand the soil we stood on. I had worked this demanding red dirt for 50 long, grueling years, waking up at 4 in the morning before the sun could even touch the horizon, breaking my spine day after day to keep the family legacy alive, and sitting on the back porch every single evening watching the sky turn purple over the pastures. But the entire trajectory of my quiet life completely rearranged itself on a scorching August night in 1994. When I went to check the bed of my truck before turning in and found a terrified, battered 14-year-old runaway boy hiding beneath a tarp. He was emaciated, his ribs practically cutting through his skin, and his arms were covered in deep, purple welts from escaping a group of brutal cartel coyotes who had exploited him near the southern border. All he possessed in the entire world was a scratched brass military compass passed down from his late father, its glass face cracked, but its needle pointing steadily true north. I didn't call the law, and I didn't turn my back. Instead, I carried him into my kitchen, wrapped him in a warm blanket, and fed him 3 straight bowls of my late wife's chili. Over the next 2 years, that boy, whose name was Leo, worked harder than any grown ranch hand I had ever hired, refusing to take a single break even in the 100-degree summer heat. But it was what he did in the dark hours that changed everything. While my own son was out spending money, Leo would sit at the workbench in the equipment shed with a pencil behind his ear, meticulously organizing our messy ranch accounting ledgers, because his brain possessed an uncanny, genius-level mastery over numbers. He traced a 14-month pattern of billing errors and caught our old distributors skimming thousands of dollars from our accounts. Seeing his brilliant potential and his fierce loyalty, I made a choice that permanently fractured my household. I took my entire private savings account, $11,400 that had been saved for over a decade to buy a neighboring 40-acre grazing pasture, and spent every single cent on securing Leo's legal citizenship paperwork and funding his pre-law education. My own son, Julian, watched this with an ancient, toxic resentment festering in his chest, convinced that a pariah baka was actively stealing his birthright and his father's affection. Julian eventually confronted me in the barn, his voice flat with pure venom, declaring that he had to earn his place on the ranch every single day while a runaway stranger was handed everything, before he turned his back and walked away into the dark, leaving a shadow of guilt that would haunt the household for years. While Leo eventually moved away to the capital to build his legal career, holding that brass compass tightly and swearing he would return the favor when the time came. As the years rolled on, the architecture of my life began to crumble piece by piece. My beloved wife passed away after a swift, devastating battle with illness, leaving the house deafeningly quiet. And without her grounding presence, Julian completely lost his way. He drowned himself in the underground gambling circuits of the oil fields, borrowing heavily from predatory sharks, until he owed over $300,000 to men who threatened to put a bullet in his head if he didn't pay by the end of the spring. It was during this exact window of desperate vulnerability that a massive energy conglomerate conducted a secret subsurface geological survey across the county and discovered a colossal, oil-bearing shale formation running directly beneath my property lines, estimating over 4 million barrels of premium recoverable oil worth an astronomical $25 million. A smooth-talking corporate representative named Carter Webb arrived on my porch in a luxury vehicle, sliding a one-page contract across my kitchen table that offered a clean $4.2 million in cash to buy the ranch outright. I looked at the numbers, recognized the predatory gap between their offer and the land's true value, and told him that my grandfather had broken this caliche ground with his bare hands. My father had worked it until his fingers wouldn't close, and I fully intended to die on it. It was absolutely not for sale. Seeing his multi-million-dollar financial savior slipping through his fingers, Julian's desperation turned into pure, murderous malice, and he formed a secret alliance with Carter Webb behind the barn that very night. Within a week, Julian's ex-wife, Sarah, began coming around the house under the pretense of looking after an aging, lonely man whose joints were stiffening from arthritis. She volunteered to refill my blue plastic weekly pill organizer from the prescription bottles in the bathroom. But what I didn't know was that she was systematically crushing a heavy, unprescribed chemical sedative called lorazepam and mixing it into my daily blood pressure medication. Within 20 days, a thick, suffocating chemical fog rolled over my mind. My thoughts began to form like sluggish honey, my speech became slurred, and my hands trembled so severely I could barely open a kitchen drawer. Taking absolute advantage of my state, Julian walked into the house alongside a corrupt notary public, spread the final corporate transfer documents across the table, and forced my heavily drugged, semi-conscious hand to sign a full, unlimited power of attorney, believing their perfect crime was complete before driving me out into the rain to be disposed of in a state facility. I was shivering, drenched to the skin, and walking aimlessly down the muddy county road when the flashing lights of a sheriff's cruiser found me. The deputy, a lifelong friend who remembered a quiet kindness I had shown him during his own darkest years, pulled me into the warm cab, wrapped a heavy wool blanket around my shoulders, and listened as the terrifying truth spilled out of my mouth. Recognizing the corporate power dynamic at play, he bypassed the tapped department radios entirely, pulled out his personal phone, and dialed a direct private line to the managing partner of the top corporate litigation firm in the state. When the line connected, the sharp, disciplined voice on the other end belonged to none other than Leo, the runaway boy from the truck bed, who had spent the last 18 years transforming himself into the most feared legal weapon in the capital. Leo didn't ask how we got the number, and he didn't waste a single second on nostalgia. His very first words were an intense demand to know if I was safe. He then revealed a shocking secret. His firm had flagged unusual title searches on my ranch 6 months prior, and he had already built a massive, comprehensive asset map of Julian's debt profile and Carter Webb's history of targeting elderly landowners through chemical capacity compromise. With only 22 days left before the official closing date on the deed transfer, Leo took absolute control of the situation with lethal, military-grade legal precision. Working through the night, his team secured an emergency temporary restraining order from a federal judge to freeze the land title, prepared a motion to completely void the power of attorney on grounds of criminal medical manipulation, and filed a direct, sealed felony referral with the district attorney's office. The next morning, the sun cleared the horizon like a flat, orange disk, throwing long, dramatic shadows across the red dust of the ranch as Julian, Sarah, and Carter Webb arrived on the property alongside a corporate surveying crew, fully believing their multi-million-dollar clean getaway was bought and paid for. But just as the crew began unloading tripods into the yard, a massive convoy of black, unmarked SUVs and sheriff's cruisers swept through the iron gates, completely surrounding the perimeter. Leo stepped out of the lead vehicle, carrying 3 thick blue folders against his chest like armor, walking onto the dirt with 18 years of accumulated purpose in every single stride. He snapped his briefcase open right across the hood of my son's truck and laid out the devastating hand of cards he had dealt them. Folder number 1 held a certified forensic toxicology report from the hospital's secure storage, proving a massive, lethal concentration of lorazepam had been introduced into my system during the exact timeline of the signing. Folder number 2 held high-resolution photographic evidence captured secretly by our sharp-eyed neighbor, documenting my completely slumped frame and physical impairment while the papers were being forced in front of me. And folder number 3 completely dismantled the corporate execution, exposing a hidden, fraudulent wire transfer of $240,000 paid directly from Vantage Energy into Julian's private offshore account on the exact day of the signing. A direct corporate kickback for selling out his own father. Carter Webb attempted to take a panicked step backward toward his vehicle, but the assistant district attorney stepped directly into his path, her face a mask of clinical severity as she informed him that his passport was flagged and his assets were frozen under federal fraud charges. Julian stood completely frozen, his eyes widening in raw, disoriented horror as the deputy stepped forward, unclipped the steel handcuffs from his belt, and read aloud the Sanjin charges of first-degree felony elder abuse, fraudulent inducement, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. The sharp, mechanical click of the cuffs closing behind my son's back hit my soul like a physical blow, resurrecting a painful memory of him as a 4-year-old child running through our living room with toy handcuffs on Christmas morning, his mother laughing behind him as they searched for the key. I locked my knees and forced myself to stay standing on my own dirt, because a real man doesn't break, even when his chest is tearing completely in two. Suddenly, Sarah's legs completely gave out beneath her, and she sank straight down into the red dirt of the yard, carefully placing her coffee mug on the earth as she began to weep, a violent, unfixable sobbing that shook her entire frame as she wailed that she was terrified of dying old and poor, begging for a forgiveness that no longer existed in this valley. At the door of the patrol car, Julian stopped, turned his head, and looked back at me across the distance. And for the very first time in his 38 years of life, I saw the true, crushing weight of reality hit his face. The devastating knowledge of what he had done to his own bloodline before the door slammed shut and the convoy pulled away into the morning light, leaving the yard in an absolute, ringing silence. Leo walked over to my side, his silent shoulder pressing firmly against mine to offer structural support without cheapening the immense grief of the moment with hollow words. He guided me around to the isolated back porch facing east toward the open pastures, the exact spot where I always went when the world became too heavy for four walls. We sat together on the wooden steps as the low afternoon light began to pour across the red earth like melted gold, illuminating the vast Texas landscape. He reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out the old brass military compass, and placed it gently in my palm, his jaw working hard as he whispered that he had finally found his way home to save the man who had saved him. I held the warm metal, watched the steady needle pointing true north without a single doubt, and told him softly that I had known he was monitoring the title since November. Leo went rigid, his eyes filling with wet brilliance as he asked why I had never called him for help before the poison took hold. I looked him dead in the soul and told him that I needed to see if the lesson I taught him at that bus station in 1996 had gone deep enough into his heart to hold against the world. That a real man never turns his back on the land or the people who stood by him when he had nothing. A single, clean tear cut through the dust on his face as his frame dropped in a massive, overwhelming release of a burden he had carried for nearly 2 decades. his voice breaking clean as he whispered that it held. 3 weeks later, inside a silent, sunlit courtroom, my hand was completely steady as I picked up a heavy fountain pen and signed the final line of a formal legal adoption petition, binding the runaway boy from the truck and the old rancher legally as father and son for the rest of our days. We walked out into the brilliant, absolute warmth of the June sun, climbing into the truck together to drive home through the gates of our ranch, proving to the world that family stories aren't always written in the rigid ledger of biology. Sometimes the strongest, most unbreakable bloodlines are forged by a righteous choice made in the absolute dark, a hot meal offered to a starving stranger, and a compass that always remembers the exact way back to the people who saved you.